And now let's introduce today's speaker, Donna Knapp. Donna has over 25 years of experience in the IT industry, working as a practitioner, a consultant, and trainer. She is ITSM Academy's Curriculum Development Manager, developing course materials and training programs. Donna is an ITIL expert, a certified process design engineer, a certified ISO 20000 consultant manager, a certified Scrum Master, and is certified in knowledge-centered support principles. Donna has developed a number of highly successful service desk-related seminars, including ITIL at the Service Desk and Customer Service Excellence for the Service Desk Professional. She's the author of 2 college textbooks, A Guide to Service Desk, A Guide to Service Desk Concepts in the 4th edition, and A Guide to Customer Service Skills for Service Desk Professionals, 3rd edition, with the 4th edition coming out this year. Donna is also the author of the ITSM Process Design Guide titled Developing, Reengineering, and Improving IT Service Management, which serves as the foundation for our popular CPD e-course. Good morning, Donna.
Hi. Hi, everybody. So, Karen, if you could make me presenter so everyone could see my slides, that would be great. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining me this morning, and thank you so much for participating in the polls. I'm going to use some of the information you provided as I go along. So I'm going to talk today about process integration, metrics, and setting expectations. Yes?
I'm sorry. Excuse me 1 minute. I can't identify you on here. Lisa, can you? On the presenter?
I've taken it.
Okay, thanks.
I love when you're in control, Donna.
Y'all should be seeing my slides now, yes?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. You know, when Karen was reading through my credentials, I always kind of say to people, if nothing else, what my credentials should tell you about me is that I'm a little bit of a process geek. And process integration is particularly interesting to me. You know, a lot of times folks will tell me that they have very mature processes, and then when I start talking to them about how their processes are integrated, they find out that maybe their processes aren't as mature as they are. And one of the reasons why I find this topic particularly interesting is because as you start to mature your processes and as you start to integrate your processes, it starts to influence your metrics. And you can either kind of drive metrics in the direction you want, or you can have an unexpected impact on your metrics, and that can very much influence perceptions within your organization. So one of the things I want to talk about today is the kind of life cycle of your metrics as you start to mature and integrate your processes. And then very importantly, I'll talk as I go along about setting expectations for what's going to happen to your metrics as you make these changes. So I'm going to talk for just 1 second about process maturity. And the reason why I kind of have to talk about process maturity before I go any further is because if you look at and I'm showing you here, the ITIL process maturity framework, any maturity framework is typically going to have this scale. It's going to be, you know, typically 1 through 5 levels of maturity. Initial level of maturity is going to be that you really don't even have a process at all. And some of you may be going through that in your organizations where you're still just having conversations about what is a process versus what is a procedure. And that's okay. I mean, that's part of your maturation process for your organization. But as your processes mature, you define your processes, right, versus your procedures, your processes themselves. You start to set objectives. You start to put targets in place. And there's actually a litmus test between level 3 and level 4 maturity. And that litmus test has to do with process interfaces. So is a given process interfacing effectively with other processes? And it's really important to understand that you'll never have, your process will never perform as well as it possibly can. Conceivably, you're sitting up at this managed or optimizing level until you have, in fact, addressed your interfaces. And then the final litmus test is, not just do you have clear objectives and goals for your processes, but are they strategically aligned with the goals and objectives of your business? So interfaces are an important part of the maturation process. So I want to talk a little bit about the life cycle of your metrics, and I'm going to use an example. I'm going to use incident management as an example. Now, the next couple of things I'm going to talk about are actually techniques. So while I'm going to use an incident management process to have this conversation, remember that you can actually go through this exercise with any of your processes and the metrics associated with any of your processes. But let's talk about incident management. So let's say we introduce a new service into our production environment. Initially, you're going to see the number of incidents associated with that service go up, right? Because we're starting to get calls to the service desk. You know, folks are learning how to use the service. You know, some of your kind of early on types of questions are going to be raised. And in time, if you have a good problem management process in place, problem management is going to look at those recurring incidents, and it's going to strive to eliminate those recurring incidents. If nothing else, problem management is going to give feedback to your development organization to look at what are chronic failures and address those failures, either by making changes or by you know, planning to address that failure in the next release of this particular service. So part of problem management's job is to drive down the incident count. And if you're doing problem management well, you should be able to baseline that and to be able to demonstrate and show proof that problem management is in fact doing its job. Now, anybody out there who's in a service desk setting, you know that, you know, initially when you have lots of relatively straightforward incidents, maybe lots of recurring incidents, if you've got a good knowledge management process in place, if you've got highly skilled staff in place, your first contact resolution is going to be relatively high for that set of incidents. Over time, as problem management starts to eliminate the easier stuff or the recurring stuff, if you don't set expectations properly, everyone's going to be a little bit surprised by the fact that your first contact resolution is actually going to go down. And so now we have to start to look at things like the skill set of our staff. We have to look at things like the knowledge management resources that we have in place. We have to look at things like the authority of our service desk staff. I sometimes hear that organizations say that in order to keep their first contact resolution up, they actually have to give greater authority to the front line. So things that normally they wouldn't be able to do because they just don't have the authority, right? They don't have the rights and privileges, and so they had to historically send that off to level 2. We're now going to push that down to the front line and provide the front line the capability to do that. So in time, you need to start looking at things like your first contact resolution, your mean time to recover, right? Are you fully understanding these incidents well enough that you can reduce the time that it takes you to resolve those incidents? Are expected incidents occurring? And if you're wondering what expected incidents are, hopefully my ITIL aficionados out there know that expected incidents are known errors. So here's where we see knowledge management coming into play as well, that we knew about this error. It was something that was maybe identified during testing, or it was something that was identified during a pilot, and we brought it into the live production environment, knowingly brought it into the live production environment. But the good news is we know how to deal with it. So in time, again, with good problem management, you're going to start to see the number of incidents come down. As you get better at change management, you're also going to see the number of incidents come down. Think about what change management's job is. Its job is to minimize risk. So if you have an effective change management process, you're going to see fewer incidents occurring as a result of change. We could certainly introduce service asset and configuration management here as well, because part of what service asset and configuration management's job is to give change management the information to work effectively. If you are being truly proactive, you have good, what ITIL calls warranty processes in place. And the warranty processes are availability, capacity, security, IT service continuity management. The role of those processes is to, during the service design stage of the life cycle, plan adequately for the needs of the business. And if we've done that, so we've got the infrastructure in place, we've got the capacity in place, we've got the redundancy in place, we've got the disaster recovery techniques in place that are needed, we are proactively preventing incidents from occurring. And again, so then you're going to start to see where you're going to drive down some of those incidents that might be occurring as a result of inadequate capacity, as an example, or inadequate information security. Over time, you should get to a point, and again, we're talking about a given service here, where you can really start to predict when you're going to see a little bit of a bump in your incidents. And typically, that's going to revolve around when releases are occurring. So you can see this kind of little gentle curve where we know we've got a new release coming into the production environment. We've got some expected incidents, right? We've maybe got some known errors that we're bringing into the live production environment. And quite frankly, anytime you reduce a new change into the production environment, you're going to see that just if nothing else, you're going to see the number of how-to questions go up, and you're going to see just, again, that little bump in the number of incidents that are occurring. So here's where you can see, and again, I used incident management simply as an example, but by integrating incident management with other processes, and every process has a relationship with every other process. So I've given you a handful of examples here, but we could talk about just about any ITIL process and how it can positively influence the number of incidents that are occurring. Let's take just another example very quickly. You could also look at your changes and the success rate of your changes. And you could go through this same life cycle to see how the success rate of your changes is being influenced by integration with other processes. Now, one of the things that has to be considered here in the mix of all of this is the role of service level management. Now, service level management is an interesting process because a lot of folks are very familiar with the concept of SLAs. And in fact, 85% of you said you are in fact measuring against service level targets. So it's something that's very familiar to this audience. But here's a really interesting point. There's a very big difference between SLAs, service level agreements, and a service level management process. And HDI actually did a study, and they found that 74% of their members are actually measuring against SLAs. So comparably high to our audience today. But here's the interesting point. Less than 30% of those organizations actually have a service level management process in place. So what it says is that organizations have put in place SLAs without the benefit of a fully mature process. And what the service level management process's job is to, first of all, identify service level requirements, so be out there working with the business to make sure we understand what the business's requirements are, and then pass those requirements over to all of the service level management processes, so incident and problem and change, all of the warranty processes, and say, in essence, to these processes, okay, incident management as an example, the business is saying that they need priority 1 incidents recovered within 2 hours. What's it going to take to do that? All of the processes then give back to service level management options for satisfying the business's requirements and what it's going to cost to satisfy those requirements. And here's where negotiation needs to occur. One of the really fundamental premises of service management as a concept is that the business has to be willing to fund whatever it is they say they require. And I know a lot of you are sitting out there saying, not my business, and I understand that. In some organizations, the business is very demanding, and it's constantly saying, we want, we want, we want. but our budgets aren't going up, the level of funding isn't there. And here's where introducing your service level management process gives you the ability to have that conversation with the business. Let's talk about what it's going to cost in order to satisfy these requirements, and let's verify that you do, in fact, have this requirement. I use availability management as an easy example because if the business says they want 100% availability 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you all know, or most of you out there know, that's going to cost a chunk of change. And is the business in fact willing to fund that, and is it in fact really necessary? So some negotiation has to occur, and before we can finalize that SLA, it's very important that we put in place things like operational level agreements, OLAs, and contracts. So we have to make sure that any internal organization that's going to be involved in meeting that SLA, or any external organization in the case of contracts, that they are in fact in agreement with regard to what we've negotiated with the business. So they've agreed that given this level of funding, we can in fact satisfy this target, and we are going to be capable of meeting that target. So once we've gone through that negotiation, we've got all those underpinning agreements in place, the OLAs and the contracts, then and only then can we really sign those SLAs. Now, for a lot of you, you may say, we have SLAs in place, but we never went through that process. And I think that's reality for a lot of organizations, that the SLAs kind of got created, and maybe a best guess was made to determine what those targets should be, and maybe you've in fact even validated those targets over time. But the question becomes, are you constantly on the lookout for those new business requirements? I see a lot of organizations where they're satisfying the SLA targets, but the business is still dissatisfied. So somewhere along the line, it kind of says we're not meeting the requirements. We're probably doing a good job of meeting SLAs, which really just speaks to the target that was set at a point in time, but we're not necessarily doing a good job of satisfying current requirements, because current requirements are constantly changing. And then service level management's job, or all of the processes, report their achievements back to service level management, and then service level management reports to the business. So very important notion, because again, service level management sets the targets for every single process. So let's talk again about process integration, and let's talk through a little bit of a technique for improving your processes through process integration. Let's begin by first of all looking at the incident management process. And this technique is called the expanded incident life cycle. But again, this is just a technique, so you can apply this technique to any other process. It doesn't have to just be applied to the incident management process. Remember that what service level management's job is to set the targets. So you can see the SLAs over here on the right-hand side. This is where we're talking about things like our resolution target for our incidents, our process for verifying that a customer is indeed satisfied with our incidents, agreeing on what the duration is that we'll reopen an incident. Very few organizations actually use reopen, but you kind of have to understand that if you're not capturing the percentage of incidents that are reopened, chances are you're not giving problem management some of the information that it needs to try to eliminate some recurring issues that you have in your organization. So it's really a valuable metric if it's something that you can look at. If you're not looking at it now, I encourage you to look into it. Now, I mentioned that part of what service level management also does is put in place these OLAs and the contracts. So what the expanded incident life cycle says is to break your process, and again this technique works for any process, down into the state changes that occur within that process. So we identify an incident, we record it, perhaps we escalate it to another part of the organization, we acknowledge it, we resolve it, and so forth. Your state changes may be slightly different within your organization, but I think you understand the point. And then let's start to put some targets on the duration that it's taking us to pass through these different state changes. Now, these targets will be in our OLAs and in our contracts because they really have to do with how our internal organizations or our contractors are actually executing this activity. The business doesn't necessarily care about this. This is an important concept. What the business cares about is over on the right-hand side. Just get her done with quality, right? Resolve my incident in the time frame that I expect according to SLAs. What happens in between, as long as it's progressing and as long as we're satisfying our customers appropriately, they don't really care about. But we care about it because it's very much how, number one, we're going to be capable of hitting those targets, and it also is going to enable us to improve the efficiency of that process. So look at your state changes, and part of what the expanded incident life cycle enables you to do is within those state changes, look at and figure out, all right, where can I use process integration in order to improve just a single section of my process? When folks are trying to improve processes, sometimes they try to look at the entire process, and it can be a little bit of overwhelming. So if you actually just kind of chunk it down a little bit and just look at one single section of a process. So take, if you have a critical application, take all of the incidents associated with that critical application and look at, all right, how long is it taking us to identify and then record those incidents? And then start to use problem management to figure out what can we do to reduce that time. So problem management, for example, has all kinds of great techniques, the 5 whys techniques. Why is this taking so long? You can use good old-fashioned brainstorming. You can use chronological analysis, right? There are lots of, again, problem management techniques that you can use to reduce that duration. You also can use knowledge management just in terms of having good procedures in place, just by having maybe scripts in place, by having access to automated links that can help to reduce the amount of time that it takes that activity. I think you kind of get the point that I'm trying to make, that you can apply just by looking at a single process. You can apply integration and use your processes to improve that section. Now, I'm kind of talking about process integration here, but remember this can also be framework integration and standard integration. So you could, for example, look at ISO 20000 and say, and for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with ISO 20000, it's the international standard for service management. And what ISO 20000 does is determine what are the minimum critical activities that are needed to perform a particular process. And for processes like incident management, problem management, all of the core ITIL processes, they give you what are those minimum critical steps. So if you have a bureaucratic process, one of the things that you can do is look at ISO 20K and see what ISO 20K says are those minimum critical activities, and look at streamlining out some of those things that are not required. You could also use your lean practices here, right? So identify your sources of waste within that particular part of your process and look at how you can reduce that waste. Now, notice that before we even get started, certainly the event management process could be used to more automatically identify the number of incidents that are occurring. I've talked about knowledge and problem management. And if you look over here on the right-hand side, you can also see that part of what you can look at in reducing the amount of time that it takes you to actually get to restoration of service is look at your change management process. So do you have some changes that you're today handling as normal changes? So in other words, in order to make that change, I have to go in front of the cab, I have to get approval. If that type of change is really critical to restoring service or resolving an incident, maybe you can look at ways to minimize the risk associated with that change and have that be a standard change. And standard changes can actually be just executed that day. Proceduralize it, and typically what goes into creating a standard change is to proceduralize it, get approval on the procedures, and then again, you you typically don't have to go in front of the cab in order to get approval to execute that change. So this technique, the expanded incident lifecycle I mentioned, can be used for any single process, and the technique is really to chunk up your process, look at your state changes, baseline where you are for any given state change, make improvements, perhaps through applying better integration with other processes, and then go back and baseline again so that you can show proof of concept, so that you can show that you did in fact improve the efficiency of even if only one part of the process. In time, as you work your way through all of your different state changes, you'll find that the overall duration of your process is going to improve. And here's where, for those of you who are familiar with Scrum as a process, Scrum is really about making kind of time-boxed incremental changes. So you could actually have sprints, and if you're not familiar with Scrum, just kind of Google Scrum and you'll see all of this language where it talks about sprints. But sprints are these little time-boxed iterations where you can actually go and kind of have a sprint where you look at one state change, and then in your next sprint look at the next state change and the next sprint, and so on until you've looked at all of the state changes in your process. And again, over time, you're going to find that you're able to effectively improve all of your processes. So I've talked about process integration, and I've talked about things like improving the efficiency and effectiveness of your processes. So let's use that as a segue to talk about metrics. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize is going forward, we really have to look at what we're measuring. And I really want to be clear here. I'm not discounting performance metrics and their value. So traditional efficiency metrics and effectiveness metrics. But going forward, we really do have to understand that for the business to value the IT organization, we have to start talking about things that are meaningful to the business. So things like customer satisfaction, I was very excited to see that 86% of you are measuring customer sat. Performance against those service level targets. User productivity, 23% of you are measuring user productivity. And that's going to become a very important metric going forward. You know, if you look at some of the biggest initiatives that organizations have in place today, they're really looking at talent management, and they're looking at how they can improve the efficiency of their talent. So how do we do that? Some of the things we do is by providing more and more mobile technology, or some of you may have in place initiatives to really start to look at how can we do things like reduce mean time to repair devices so that we can maximize that user productivity. Especially in today's environment where more and more we're moving to the cloud, it's really important to know that when those cloud-based services, for example, aren't available, people truly are just out of work. You know, in many cases, the manual processes that we used to have in place that people could fall back to don't even exist anymore. So increasingly, user productivity is something that's incredibly important to the business. Business impact has always been important, and time to value is really an emerging metric. Time to value, 21% of you were measuring time to value. And I'd be very much interested, and if you all could chat in, I'd be very much interested to see how you're measuring time to value. I'm going to talk about it coming up in a second. But what time to value really speaks to is the time from the point at which the business has a requirement to the point at which they are, in fact, realizing value in the live production environment for that new feature or for that new service. Think about it. Everything has sped up in this day and age. The expectations are so high in organizations in terms of how quickly we can get new technologies up and running. And organizations today are really starting to understand that they lose their competitive advantage for any new technology very, very, very quickly. As soon as it gets out into the world, you know, that a company has introduced some really new cool feature on their website, every other company that is similar follows very, very quickly in terms of introducing that new feature. And if they don't, again, they're really going to lose that competitive advantage. So time to value is critical, and really, especially for organizations that are introducing agile practices, DevOps practices, time to value is one of those key metrics that you can use to demonstrate the effectiveness of those practices. And also, of course, trends, but more importantly, trends that are really meaningful to the business, things that really could potentially help the business to better capitalize on technology. So most of you are probably familiar with this measurement framework, and one of the things that I want to do is use an example to talk about this measurement framework. So the measurement framework says, let's start with the business vision. Let's identify critical success factors associated with that vision. Let's determine key performance indicators. And key performance indicators, very simply, are just metrics. They're just really, really important metrics. And then let's look at what we, in fact, have to measure. So in this particular case, I've set a vision, or I've used as an example a vision where this organization needs to deliver cost-effective services to their external customers in a very kind of cost-effective way and with great speed. In a very competitive time frame. So what's a critical success factor for that? So an example might be to make changes quickly and accurately. Now, quickly and accurately are two very, very different things, aren't they? I'm kind of known for using this phrase, get her done with quality, right? Getting things done quickly doesn't necessarily mean it's being done right. So we have to make sure that we're also delivering those changes in an accurate way. So if we set that as a critical success factor, KPIs would be things like perhaps increasing the number of standard changes. So that would enable us to make changes more quickly. If you go back to ITIL version 2, ITIL version 2 actually said that organizations should strive to have 80% of their changes be standard changes. Now that language it got eliminated from subsequent versions of ITIL. But I think in a lot of organizations, it's actually quite the opposite, where maybe 20% of changes are standard changes, and that means that 80% of your changes are having to go through the cab and maybe go through an overly bureaucratic process. The other key performance indicator could be to reduce the number of emergency changes. Why is that a good KPI? Well, we know that emergency changes cause incidents. We know that when we try to make changes too quickly, typically it causes some kind of a negative impact down the line. So if we look at reducing the number of emergency changes, we can increase the accuracy with which we're making those changes. And of course, in order to do all of this, we have to keep track of the number of changes by type. And then you can see where we're now able to monitor those changes. And one of the things that you can do, and here's where we start to see process integration come into play as well, we can keep track of, all right, if we do have emergency changes, which ones are linked to incidents, which ones are maybe linked to projects. If we have a relatively high number of emergency changes linked to projects, why is that? Why aren't we able to take those changes through the normal change management process? Or are perhaps those changes low enough risk that we can actually just make them standard changes, right? Because a lot of times in organizations, things become an emergency change just so that we can hit a deadline, right? So how can we help the development organization, especially if you've got agile development practices in place, if you've got DevOps practices in place, how can we speed up the time frame within which we're making changes? And maybe the answer is we target those emergency changes that are linked to projects and see how we can pull that number down. Now, in the spirit of process integration, remember too that we can start to also look at incidents caused by these different changes and see, what we should be able to correlate is that for the number of standard changes, we have relatively few incidents. If we have emergency changes, chances are you're going to be seeing a higher percentage of incidents. So what can we do, again, to drive that number of incidents down the number of incidents that are being caused by those changes. So you can really start to, by changing how you're handling changes, sorry for the redundancy there, it's almost like a dial, right? If we change how we handle changes, we can influence the number of metrics, right? The question becomes, are you influencing it in a good way, or are you influencing it in a bad way? I mentioned that I would talk briefly about measuring time to value. This is an emerging metric that we're seeing in organizations today. Time to value, and you see the description down at the bottom, really measures the time it takes the business to realize value from a new feature or for a new service. So from the point at which we received that business requirement to the point at which they are experiencing value in our live production environment, how do we measure that? Well, the main process we're going to look at is the change management process, but it is very important to understand that value is going to be very, very much influenced by processes like our incident management and our problem management processes. Notice that incident management and problem management are pointing back in the service life cycle. The better job we do of feeding incidents and problems back to the development organization, and the more quickly we feed that information back to the development organization, the better job they're going to be able to do when they're making changes, when they're developing new features and new services, to eliminate those incidents or to prevent those problems before they even make their way into the production environment. Also, the better job we do at capturing knowledge, the better job we do at capturing known errors. So even if we do bring some type of an error, and typically known errors, the business agrees that it's acceptable to bring that error into the production environment. The better job we do of capturing those known errors, the more satisfied the business is going to be. Because if nothing else, the business wants an answer, right? So even if they have some type of a question or an incident in the live production environment, can we very quickly answer it? Can we very quickly resolve it? And can we give the business confidence that we know how to deal with this type of situation? Release and deployment management also comes into play. For organizations that are looking at DevOps, as an example, release and deployment management is proving to be a very critical process, and it has a component to it called early life support. And it's in early life support where you set the acceptance criteria with the business in terms of when they will view this new service or this new feature as live, as established in the production environment. So that acceptance criteria is important because it gives you that criteria that says this is where we are realizing value, or this is what has to happen, more importantly, in order for us to realize value. And really at that point, once that service acceptance criteria has in fact been accepted, then we can start to look at closing out that change and doing our post-implementation review and doing our timestamp in terms of when we realize value. So that's one of those metrics you're going to hear a little bit more about as we go along. So I talked about setting expectations as we went along, but one of the things you have to understand is, first of all, how expectations are being set. So really, this is where you have to get out and you have to talk to your customers and you have to understand where they're getting their expectations from. And the reality is, in this day and age, a lot of times they're getting their expectations from TV, they're getting their expectations from other service providers that they're working with, perhaps with their home computer technology. Really, you kind of have to look at a typical technology user today. You know, very often we think we can go to the App Store and buy or download some new technology. We might not even have to buy it. Download new technology and have it be available right away. You know, there's commercials on TV today where folks go into, you know, the store and you see like young kids who are going in and having conversations about their company's or their family's cell phone plan or their family's data plan. We think we can walk into a store and we can buy this stuff, and I know that makes life very, very challenging for IT organizations, and I absolutely understand there's a very big difference between buying a cell phone and, you know, putting in place a new ERP system. But what you kind of have to understand is that your customers maybe don't. right? So their expectations are being set by how they're able to use technology on a day-to-day basis. So you really have to understand that. Or maybe their expectations are being set by what your competitors are doing with technology. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what you're doing. So what can you do? Capture and monitor those expectations, and you also can certainly influence expectations. So one of the things that you have to look at is your policies within your organization, how you're handling contacts, how you're handling complaints. I actually had a situation one time where I was complaining about some technology not working, and the person actually said to me, yeah, you're like the 10th person to complain about that today. And I kind of had to laugh because it's like, okay, at some point, you know, if enough people are complaining, you have to actually do something about the complaint. How we're handling incidents, how we're handling requests. Understand that expectations now are that those activities are happening far more almost instantaneously, right, than they've ever been before. Also looking at your service transition policies. Now notice I said service transition policy as opposed to change management policy or release policy. ITIL says very clearly that change management, service asset and configuration management, release and deployment management, those processes really have to be in sync. So if you say, for example, that you're going to put a particular service under control of service asset and configuration management, you've just said that you're going to put it under the control of change management and that you also have to have it managed by release and deployment management. They have to stay in sync. So your policies for how you're handling transitions are much, much broader than your release policy. Having said that, you need to know that the release policies for some organizations are really changing dramatically. Whereas organizations used to talk about 2 releases per year or, you know, 4 releases per year, some organizations are now talking about releases every day and many, many releases every day. Now, you have to decide for your organization if that's right for your organization, and it may be that your policy states that for certain types of releases, they can happen daily, and for other types of releases, they still have to happen quarterly. You really have to look at your business and what your business is capable of absorbing in terms of the amount of change. And you also have to bring in your processes. So you can see down on the bottom of your screen processes like information security management, service catalog management, change management, right? All of these processes come into play in terms of ensuring you've got the right policies in place. Once you've done a little bit of an overhaul of your policies, then you have to get out there and communicate those policies. So your service catalog can do a really good job of setting expectations and helping people understand why the risk associated with one change is so much greater than the risk associated with some other change, or the risk associated with acquiring some other service. And so maybe there's going to be a longer lead time in order to have that service implemented. Certainly your service desk website or your employee handbooks, all of those different types of things can really help you in terms of communicating your policies. And then at the end of the day, you always have to be very, very good at reporting on and promoting your achievements and speaking to the business about how well you're doing in terms of not only improving the efficiency and effectiveness of your processes through, for example, process integration, but also just in terms of making sure that your policies are customer-friendly policies as opposed to what are sometimes policies that are convenient for IT, but not necessarily so convenient for the business. So some final thoughts I want to share with you before I open things up for questions. You know, one of the questions I asked everybody about was the education that you're providing to your process owners. You know, ITIL IT Service Management makes it very, very clear that every process must have a process owner. It is the process owner who is accountable for that process. And one of my first suggestions is that you designate and educate your process owners. So a process owner has to understand not only that process and everything about that process, right? All of the best practices associated with that process, and not only ITIL best practices, but a good process owner will go out and look at other frameworks like COBIT, or go out and look at the ISO 20000 standard and really understand what those other frameworks and standards are saying about that particular process. And a good process owner will also understand how their process interfaces with other processes, how what they do within their process can influence the efficiency and effectiveness and metrics of another process, but also how their process can be improved by better integration with a given process. So how does a process owner acquire that level of education? You know, one of the things I asked you was how many of you require your process owners to be ITIL expert, and 6% of you said you require ITIL experts require your process owners to be an ITIL expert. And that really is a good qualification, because an ITIL expert, as a certification, an ITIL expert has to understand the entire ITIL service lifecycle. They have to understand the role of all of the processes within the service lifecycle and how all of those processes interface. Another suggestion was, or another one of the questions was, how many of you require your process owners to be CPDs? Certified Process Design Engineer is really about understanding how to design and improve processes, understanding that there's a methodology for doing that. So look at the education that your process owners are getting. It's great to have practitioner experience for your process owners, real-world experience using that particular process or overseeing a particular process. 49% of you require a practitioner experience. In other words, I've been there, I've done that, you know, I've been involved in actually executing this particular process, and that's awesome. You do need that practical experience. You also need that education, right? You need that broader understanding of what the process should look like or could look like through more effective integration. Record and act on suggestions and complaints, and one of the things I really encourage you to do is get good at acting on complaints. You know, a lot of times we do customer satisfaction surveys, and that's great, but I always ask folks, what's happening to the complaints, right? Are you in fact taking them? Are you acting on them? And then are you telling customers, we're listening? Based on the complaints that we heard from you in our surveys last month or last quarter, these are the actions that we have taken in order to improve our process. One of the really interesting things about acting on complaints is it gives you more complaints. And that might sound like a bad thing, but it's actually a good thing, because those complaints are always giving you an opportunity to improve. Manage your process design and improvement efforts as a project, and make sure they're tied to those wildly important business goals, right? That's a real sign of maturity in your processes. And then manage your projects to improve your processes as a program. And by managing them as a program, you make sure that you don't have one process off doing its own thing and another process off doing its own thing. You're actually managing all of your process improvements as an integrated approach, right? So you don't have one process make a change that's going to negatively, in fact, impact another change. And then at the end of the day, communicate, communicate, communicate. Make sure that everything you're doing, you're out communicating to the organization, promote the benefits of why you're making these changes, baseline where you are with a process, and then promote, you know, the improvements that you've seen as a metrics of making changes. You know, if you look at, and Gartner actually recently did a study and asked CIOs what the number one, what their top 10 initiatives are. And the number one initiative was growth and innovation. So being creative, being innovative, understanding that that's the way we've always done it isn't necessarily going to take us into the future. Be persistent. Understand that sometimes business changes will occur, even if you've suggested improvements 10 times before. Business changes may occur that make it the right time for that suggestion, so be persistent and innovate. So that's it. Thank you. And what questions are there for me? Who's giving me questions?
Donna, thank you. We have lots of questions for you today, Donna.
Excellent.
But just before we start the Q&A section, Lisa, our COO, she's here to share some information with us. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, guys. Donna, I mean, how many years have we known each other and worked together, and how is it possible that I can join a webinar with you on something kind of this basic and I still learn so much? It was awesome. It was just ridiculous. I took notes using my personal action plan, I have to say. And also, you have several questions from Cynthia. And Cynthia,
Okay.
it sounds like maybe you could, you'd like to spend a couple of maybe 15 minutes with Donna offline post-webinar. Not that we won't work on your questions during the webinar, but it sounds like maybe you're trying to get somewhere real specific. And if we can get you set up with Donna or one of our other subject matter experts for a quick call, we'll be happy to do that. And actually, I am, oh, you're welcome, Cynthia. My pleasure. I just wanted to come on to tell everyone that we are having a fun little game today instead of our Bravo games like we normally do, because next month's webinar is DevOps, Moving Beyond Early Adopters to Pragmatic Acceptance. So those of you that have read Crossing the Chasm will kind of understand where that title is coming from. And we are now delivering DevOps overviews. And what we've decided is we are going to give away 5 free seats in the July 10th DevOps Overview course, which is a 4-hour course from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And again, it's on Thursday, July 10th. And so for the first 5 folks who email info@itsmacademy.com and request a seat, you are going to get a free seat. First come, first seat. And please, please, please only request it if you really can come to it. So if that date, July 10, works for you, this is a 4-hour course that provides an introduction to DevOps, the cultural phenomenon that is enabling organizations to develop, deploy, and operate quality software faster to meet business needs. So come on in with your info ats if you're interested in learning more about it. And that's really all I wanted to say, and thank you, Donna. It was phenomenal.
Thank you, Lisa. That's a great deal. So chat it in if you're interested. And before we start the Q&A, I know some of you need to drop off. I've got, Eric is leaving for a CAD meeting. You go, Eric. So before we start, I'd just like to remind all of you that our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, May 15th, and Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of DevOps.com, is going to join us. And Alan's presentation is titled DevOps, Moving Beyond Early Adopters to Pragmatic Acceptance. And DevOps is now at the precipice of the chasm. It appears to have the momentum to make the leap. Why and how will it affect you? Separating fact from hype, examining the truth behind the myth, learn how DevOps is not a threat to IT jobs, but how it can be the greatest catalyst of improved performance that we've seen in IT in a long time. So please join us for that presentation. And Donna, are you ready for some questions?
I am.
Okay. So Arena has a question, and her question is, can CMMI ML5, dev or services, equate to idle process maturity optimizing?
Yes. Very simple answer there. It's, you know, CMMI is a maturity model. Well, it's a process improvement approach, but it's very often used to measure maturity, and 5 is the highest level. So it is absolutely comparable.
Perfect, thank you. It's interesting, we have 2 Cynthias on today. So Cynthia that has some questions, and then we have another Cynthia that she doesn't have any questions, but she did want you to know that she does have a comment, and she enjoyed this webinar, and she has a wealth of information and a plan for training.
Excellent.
Yes. So, Lisa, other people are getting as much as you got out of this too, as did I. A lot of information for us, Donna. Sandy said, great point of integrating and communicating the importance of knowing how our processes impact others. Silos are hard to take down, but they are critical to ensuring we set the enterprise up for success, not just our own process. They're fantastic. So thank you, Sandy.
Hello?
And Donna, while Karen's getting the next question together, I just wanted to tell you, remember the third question where we had other and we said, could you please chat in?
Yes.
Some of the other chat in. So this was the question about what criteria do you use. there were some folks who said ISO certified.
Good.
Daily work is related to the process. Example, service desk manager is also the incident process owner. Certified enterprise architect. This one is kind of, Susan, you're my favorite right now. Other, all plus desire / interest. So somebody has to actually be interested in doing it. So I liked that answer a lot.
Yeah.
Manager of
willingness. There you go.
Yeah, willingness. It really gave me a good giggle.
That is an awesome point. Thank you very much for that.
Manager or team lead of the functional area. And then as we don't have sufficient qualifications, those who worked for many years in the system are assigned as process owners. But those who are having ITIL qualification have priority. So it sounds like they're moving along on the right path. And that looks like the last of the other chat-ins. So I'm going to throw it back to Karen now. But I knew you wanted to know those.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I'm happy to hear ISO was in the mix there. That's great.
And Donna, Wanda is asking, can you provide an example of a wildly important goal?
Well, it's going to be whatever is wildly important to your business. So if your business is saying grow sales by 10%, that's your organization's wildly important goal. If your organization is saying increase our customer base by 20%, that's your organization's wildly important goal. So it really is just what's wildly important to your company. And, you know, that at the end of the day, what are your execs telling you is important?
Okay, thank you. And I know you're going to talk with Cynthia a little bit later, but I think that she's asking some important questions, and I think some of the other listeners may be interested to hear this. I'm sure they will be as well. And Cynthia is saying that they always seem to be focused on how they measure deficiencies with processes, but her management would like her to also track the successes. And they've got a problem management, change management, IT corrective action process to track the deficiencies. But she's looking for some ideas on how to track when processes are working.
Well, there's kind of 4 key things you have to look at. Number one, I always want to hear about compliance. So are people in fact complying with the process? Are you producing the evidence, the records, the reports, etc., that you should be producing on a regular basis? Is it functioning as efficiently as it possibly can? So given the resources that you're using to execute that process, is the cost appropriate, right? So I always use this example. You could have an incident management process that lets you, resolve all incidents within 1 hour. But how much would that cost your organization? And would that cost ever be appropriate? Probably not, right? Because not all incidents are created equal. So is the cost appropriate given the resources you're using to execute the process? And is it effective? At the end of the day, is it achieving its purpose? So those are kind of the fundamental metrics that you use to measure success. But from there, I would use baselining. So make sure that you're always producing those key performance indicators, baseline where you are now, make some improvements, and then baseline again to see, okay, if what we expected to happen as a result of these improvements was to reduce by, whatever, X% the number of incidents, or by the duration of time it takes us to, the cycle time associated with this process, right? Whatever your improvement initiative is expecting, then produce the metric that enables you to show that proof of concept. And that's kind of the nature of Agile, right, is to constantly be looking at, are we in very quick increments, are we going in the direction we want to go in? And if you're going to fail, if something isn't going to work, fail fast, right? Just go, okay, that didn't work, right? Whatever change we made to our process didn't produce the desired result, so let's look at why and take some corrective action to get us back on the right track. So baselining and really having some expected, being clear about what you expect to get out of your improvement efforts. Hopefully that made sense.
Thank you, Donna.
And at the end of the day, are you delivering value to the business, which is always, you know, here's where things like customer sat and, you know, user productivity, you know, those types of metrics also are going to enable you to show success.
And Cynthia's saying, yes, it makes sense. And she said, you mentioned 4 things. It was compliance, efficiency, baselining, and what was the 4th?
Well, typically to measure a process, you look at compliance, efficiency, effectiveness, and value. And baselining is really just a technique to take a snapshot in time. So you take a snapshot or a baseline of how efficient you are at a given point in time. You make a change, and then you take another snapshot to see where you are following, you know, the implementation of that change and the normalization of that change. Right? So baselining is kind of just a technique for taking a snapshot of a point in time. So compliance, efficiency, effectiveness, value.
Okay, she's got it. Yeah. Thank you, Cynthia. She has it. And I have a lot of great presentations. Thank you so much. And I
Thank
have
you all.
a message. I have a message for you from Glenn. He said, Donna, great job as always. Go TV Lightning, go.
That's right. Go both.
That's our question for today. So, I know, that was funny. We'll continue to bring you practitioner presentations discussing Agile and IT service management implementation experiences and challenges. And we know that people want to hear and learn from the practitioner experiences. So if you'd like to share your implementation experiences or your challenges on one of our webinars, just let us know, and we'll be happy to work with you to make that happen at one of our monthly webinars.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It really doesn't hurt.
No, it doesn't, and especially, I mean, experiences are really good, and the challenges are really good also for people to hear, because you get a lot of discussion, right, going on with that.
Sometimes the good, here's what not to do presentation is very valuable.
Sometimes that's the most valuable kind of presentation of all, if you ask me. And I want to just interrupt to say that Irina has given one of the greatest compliments we've seen. And there is, to Karen's point, there are so many, great job, this was awesome. But this webinar was fantastic. I'm very familiar with CMMI, and I just started to become more familiar with ITIL. What a great overview of process integration and associated metrics from the ITIL perspective for a newbie like me! Exclamation mark. So you've made Irina very happy today.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Go forth and measure maturity.
And Elias said, very nice presentation. I hope that you have a follow-up webinar for this. So there's something to think about for the future, too.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time that we have this morning. And again, we'll email you all a link to the Q&A from this session in just a few days. And we thank you again for joining us. I'd like to remind you that our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, May 15th, when Alan Schimmel, editor-in-chief of DevOps.com, joins us. And Alan's presentation is titled DevOps, Moving Beyond Early Adopters to Pragmatic